Okay, so today we're going to be diving into like a really complex case. It brings up like so many questions about, female sex offenders and consent and all that. Our source material today is this news report from that YouTube channel, Law&Crime. It's about this woman, Allison Leigh Schardin, 38, from Minnesota, convicted of sexual assault. And what makes this case like unusual is, it's a woman assaulting two 15-year-old boys. Kind of flips the script, right?
Yeah.
It really challenges their assumptions about like who sex offenders even are. So the basics are, Schardin met this boys hockey team from Colorado while she was on vacation, get this, with her own family. And in less than 24 hours, she engages in sexual acts with two of these boys, then later shows up at their hockey game, even though they were clearly trying to avoid her. It's a lot to unpack. So thankfully, we have Serena Townsend with us. She's a criminal defense attorney and a real expert in these kinds of cases. Serena, welcome to the deep dive. I mean, when you first looked at this case, what jumped out at you?
Honestly, the speed, just how fast everything happened. There wasn't like any obvious grooming, or prolonged interaction with the victims. It all just escalated quickly from like a casual encounter at the hotel to, well, sexual assault, all in what, less than a day? It makes you think about impulsivity, state of mind, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a really stark contrast to how we often think of these cases, right? With grooming, the manipulation, it's often a much slower burn. And, this wasn't a one-time thing either. She kept contacting the boys through Snapchat, telling them not to tell anyone, not to go to the police, and then she shows up at the game, knowing they were avoiding her. I mean, bold move.
Yeah, the cover-up attempts, trying to silence victims, that's always significant. Prosecutors definitely look at that. Points to like consciousness of guilt, right?
Yeah.
But it also, it brings up questions about reoffending, underlying issues, things that might have led to this behavior in the first place.
This case also brings up this whole, uncomfortable conversation about consent. One of the victims said, he didn't actually say no to more sexual acts, but he clearly didn't want it. He was hesitant.
Right, and this is where statutory rape comes in. The law says minors can't consent, period. Whether they say yes or no, it doesn't matter. They're just not legally able to consent to sexual activity with an adult because they're underage. It's about vulnerability, power dynamics. That imbalance just exists, even without an explicit no.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Consent is more than just yes or no. It's also about, understanding the power dynamics, coercion. Can someone really freely communicate their wishes? Especially a kid.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about, the legal outcomes of this whole thing. The prosecution wanted the max, 8 years, but Schardin got a way lighter sentence.
Yeah.
What do you think played into that?
Well, sentencing, it's complicated. Lots of factors, right? Judges consider everything, not just the crime itself, but also, past offenses, remorse, the impact of a long sentence on rehabilitation, that kind of thing. In this case, maybe the judge looked at Schardin's clean record, no prior offenses, and she pleaded guilty, which, saved the victims from testifying. That can be a big factor.
So what was the actual sentence then?
Time served. The 5 days she was already in jail after the arrest, plus 2 weekends in jail, 10 years on the sex offender registry, and court-ordered mental health treatment.
2 weekends, seriously. That seems light, incredibly light, especially with the prosecution pushing for 8 years. What are your thoughts on that?
It does seem disproportionate, right, to how serious the crime was. And this is sometimes where you see differences in sentencing, especially with female offenders. There's this societal idea that women aren't as dangerous, less likely to, reoffend, so later sentences. But it's important to remember, sexual assault is serious. Doesn't matter who does it, man or woman, it's serious.
Right, and for the victims, it's not over after 10 years, when her name comes off that registry. The impact of what she did, that stays with them. Probably a lot longer. So let's talk about that registry. 10 years. What does that even mean? What is the sex offender registry, really?
It's a way for law enforcement to keep track of people convicted of these crimes, but it's complicated. Different levels of offenders. How long you're on there depends on what you did. How much of a risk you are, supposedly. To reoffend, I mean.
So 10 years, that puts Schardin in a lower level category, right? How's that different from someone who's on there for life?
Well, the obvious one is time. After 10 years, her info's gone. Poof. From the public databases. Lifetime registration. You're on there. Well, for life. There are also, restrictions, jobs, housing. It varies, depending on what you did.
So it's this attempt to balance things, public safety and the idea that people can change, rehabilitate. It's not just about punishment, but about, managing risk, giving people a way to re-enter society eventually.
In theory, yeah. But it's a double-edged sword, right? Meant to protect people, but it can also create this huge stigma, make it really hard to rebuild your life. Even after you've, served your time, shown you're not a risk anymore.
It's complicated. Definitely a system that needs to be looked at, right? Make sure it's actually doing what it's supposed to, not just like making things worse. Let's talk about the mental health treatment. Schardin was ordered to get treatment, right? What's the goal there? How does that even work for someone like her?
Well, the main goal is to get at the root of the problem, right? The underlying factors that, contributed to the offense, and to, reduce the risk of it happening again. Ideally, it usually starts with a pretty thorough evaluation. Assess mental health, identify any red flags, risk factors, then develop a treatment plan specific to that person.
So it's not like a one-size-fits-all kind of deal?
Oh, definitely not. It's very much tailored to, the individual's specific needs and the diagnosis, if there is one.
What would that look like, a treatment plan, I mean?
It could be a lot of things. Individual therapy, group therapy, maybe medication. It just, it depends. Often cognitive behavioral therapy is used, CBT, helps people identify and change their thinking patterns, the ones that, contribute to the behavior. And relapse prevention therapy, that's another common one, focuses on coping mechanisms, strategies to avoid reoffending.
So it's not about just punishing the person, right?
Yeah.
It's about trying to figure out why they did it.
Yeah.
And giving them the tools to, change.
Yeah, that's the hope. But, therapy isn't magic. It's a process. It takes time, commitment, a lot of self-awareness, and, being willing to face some really uncomfortable stuff about yourself.
Dealing with the root of the problem, not just the symptoms.
Exactly. And it's important to remember rehabilitation. It's not a finish line. It's an ongoing thing, a journey. There will be bumps in the road. But with the right support, people can really change.
You mentioned earlier that female offenders often target people they know, family, caregivers, that kind of thing. That makes me think about how abuse might go, unnoticed, unreported, especially if there are power imbalances or if, the victim feels scared or ashamed. How can we address that, make it safer for victims to come forward?
Well, it's a tough one. It takes a lot. Education, prevention, early intervention. We have to teach kids, young people, about healthy relationships, boundaries, consent from a really young age. And we need to create safe spaces where they can actually talk about this stuff without feeling, judged, and where they can get help if they need it.
So give them the tools to recognize abuse, resist it, and make sure there are adults they trust who will believe them if something does happen.
Exactly. It's about shifting the focus from blaming victims to preventing abuse in the first place and intervening early, holding potential abusers accountable, and empowering victims to speak up.
This case has really highlighted so much the complexities of sexual abuse, the challenges of getting justice, and the importance of, talking about these things, educating ourselves.
It definitely shows us that these issues aren't going away. We need to keep paying attention, keep working on it to make things safer and more just for everyone.
We've talked about the legal stuff, the psychology, the social aspects, but I want to shift gears a little. Talk about the media. How do you think the media shapes how we see these kinds of crimes, especially when it's a woman who's the offender?
That's a really good question. The media has a huge influence, right? Shaping public opinion, how we understand complicated things like sexual abuse. But there's always the risk of bias, sensationalism, harmful stereotypes.
It's they focus on the shocking stuff,
Yeah.
the details that sell, and that can really twist how we see the whole issue.
Exactly. And with female offenders, there's this tendency to focus on how unusual it is, how unexpected the woman's gender becomes the main story. And that reinforces this idea that women don't do this, that they're not capable of sexual abuse, or that it's less serious when a woman does it.
Which is so dangerous, right? Because then victims don't get believed. And it creates this false sense of security, oh, women aren't a threat.
Exactly. We need to be really careful, critical of what we read and see in the media, and try to get different perspectives, not just the sensationalized version.
Be aware of the biases. Think critically. Go beyond the headlines.
Totally. We need to be smart about this, informed, engaged, and willing to, question our own assumptions if we really want to make a difference, make things safer.
This has been incredibly insightful, Serena. Really appreciate you breaking down all of this with us. Before we wrap up, I want to talk about the victims. We talked about the support they need right away, but what about the long-term effects? The emotional and psychological impact. How can we help them heal, rebuild their lives?
That's so important. Healing from trauma, it's It's a long road. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes ongoing support, resources, and a lot of understanding.
It's not enough to just be there in the immediate aftermath. There needs to be a system in place for long-term care.
Right. Victims of sexual abuse can experience all kinds of things. PTSD, anxiety, depression, trouble with relationships, substance abuse, and these things, they can last for years, decades even, after the abuse is over.
It's a reminder that this stuff, it doesn't just go away, it leaves a mark.
It does, and it underscores how important comprehensive long-term support is. Therapy, support groups, advocacy, mental health care, it all plays a part.
It's about recognizing that healing, it's a journey, not a destination, and victims need support every step of the way.
Exactly, and creating a culture where they feel safe coming forward, where they're believed, and where they have the resources to, not just survive, but to really heal and thrive.
It's a big task,
Right.
but it's absolutely crucial, and it takes all of us working together, individuals, communities, institutions, everyone.
I agree. We all have a part to play in creating a society where this isn't tolerated, where victims are supported and abusers are held accountable.
This deep dive has been, well, a lot of things. A sobering reminder of how complex this issue is, how hard it is to get justice, and the lasting impact on victims. But it's also been a call to action, in a way. We all have a responsibility to make the world safer, more just.
It's been a pleasure talking about this with you. Thanks for the great questions and for shining a light on these really important issues.
Thank you, Serena, for your expertise and your passion for this work. We've covered so much ground today. This specific case, consent, female offenders, the media, the long-term impacts of trauma. But I want to leave our listeners with something to think about, a question, something to spark more conversation, more reflection. So here it is. Knowing what we know now, how can we as individuals, as a society, how can we challenge the stories we tell ourselves about sexual abuse, especially when it comes to female offenders? How do we create a culture where victims feel safe coming forward, no matter who the abuser is? And how do we make sure justice is served without, making things worse with harmful biases? It's a complicated question, but it's one we need to keep asking and keep working to find answers to. It really is a conversation we need to keep having. And it starts with us, right? Looking at our own biases, what we believe, being willing to question those things and be open to different perspectives.
Exactly. We can't just sit back and hope it goes away. This isn't going away. We have to be willing to talk about it, even when it's uncomfortable. Sexual abuse, consent, the systems that, allow it to happen, the safety of our communities depends on it.
This whole deep dive has been eye-opening, to say the least. And the Schardin case, it's just one piece of a much bigger puzzle, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's a starting point, a way to look at these bigger issues, female offenders, the biases, the need to support victims, make the world safer for everyone.
We've talked about the legal stuff, the psychology,
Yeah.
societal perceptions. But I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
The sex offender registry. You said it's a tool, right, for law enforcement, public safety, but it also has limitations, can even be counterproductive.
Yeah. It's complicated. The registry, a lot of debate about it. It's meant to protect people, give them information about convicted sex offenders. But it can also, really stigmatize people, make it hard to live a normal life, even after they've served their time, even if they're not a risk anymore.
It's that balance again, isn't it? Public safety versus giving people a chance to change, to rehabilitate.
Exactly. And it's a tough one. We haven't really figured it out yet, how to get that balance right. There are so many questions about how effective it even is, the unintended consequences, the need for change.
What are some of the arguments against the registry?
Yeah.
And what kind of changes are people talking about?
Well, one big criticism is it's too broad, doesn't really make distinctions.
Yeah.
You can have someone on there who's not a risk at all, someone who did something minor years ago, but they're still on there decades later. And that can really mess up their life, jobs, housing, social life. It makes it so hard to, move on, be a part of society.
So it can actually make things worse.
Yeah.
Increase the risk of reoffending almost.
Yeah.
Because of the stigma.
That's definitely a concern if you're constantly being reminded of your past, facing all these barriers. It can lead to hopelessness, isolation, and that can make people more likely to make bad choices.
What kind of reforms are people suggesting?
A few things, like a tiered system, different levels based on the crime, the risk, maybe letting people off the registry after a while if they're low risk, and providing more support, resources to help people, reintegrate, get back on their feet.
So making it more nuanced, more effective, more focused on rehabilitation.
Right. It should be about protecting people, yes, but also recognizing that people can change and that they can contribute to society. in a positive way.
We've covered so much today, this case. Female offenders, consent, the justice system, the media, trauma. It's a lot. What's the, one thing you want listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing is to remember, this is a complicated issue, sexual abuse. It takes a lot to address it. We have to challenge our own biases, talk openly and honestly, support victims, hold abusers accountable, and fight for change in the system. It's on all of us.
It is. We all have a responsibility. We can't be silent or just look the other way. We have to do something. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a journey, challenging our assumptions, making us think about sexual abuse, consent, justice in a whole new way. We hope this conversation has been helpful, something to think about, and empowering. You're not alone in this. There's help out there, people who care. Let's keep learning, keep talking, keep working towards a world where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued.